This is Right to Life Radio with John Gerardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now...
All right, we're here with some timely reflections. All of our reflections are timely on Right to Life Radio. But I'm here today
Some of them are timeless.
Some of them are timeless. There you go.
Timely and timeless.
Timely and timeless. I'm here with my good buddy Jonathan Keller, as always, the CEO of California Family Council. Thank you so much for being here, John.
Always good to be here.
Jonathan. I need to call you that because otherwise it's very confusing with a John and a Jonathan. All right. I've got here a topic. A number of people have asked me about this topic, and it's an ongoing thing of concern for pro-lifers. And right now, in the midst of coronavirus time, we are hearing about the possibility of a vaccine. Okay, there's this floating around, this notion that maybe there's a vaccine. Maybe there will be a vaccine coming up in the next few months. Trump had floated the idea of maybe one would come out before the election. People who think that that would help Donald Trump's electoral cause therefore said that it was a rushed and politically motivated vaccine. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, there's all kinds of dispute about a vaccine, when it should come out, when it will come out, whatever. One thing that pro-lifers have had concerns about, and this is a concern with a number of different kinds of vaccines, is the question of the use of cell lines derived from aborted children. Okay? Now, this has long been an issue, and some pro-lifers don't have a great way of fully understanding how this works. And
aborted babies used in vaccines, John, isn't that a QAnon conspiracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not quite a QAnon conspiracy, but it's not exactly aborted babies in vaccines. So
no.
What we want to do today...
But it's one of those things that sounds so crazy that I think
Right.
a lot of our friends that are unfamiliar with the topic, especially people that are more progressive, are going to immediately roll their eyes and go, come on.
Are you insane?
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and then there are two ways of thinking about it. There's some people on the pro-life side who are sort of more of the conservative bent who are like, every vaccine has an aborted child in it. Therefore, if you take any vaccine, you're
killing children.
You're complicit in the murder of children. And then on the left, it's how could you have any kind of moral concerns whatsoever about the production of these vaccines? You rube, you Philistine.
Do you want people to die?
Do you want people to die? Do you want my grandmother to die, Jonathan Keller? All right, anyway. Actually, one of my grandmothers already died. Okay, anyway, moving right along. So the question has arisen about the coronavirus vaccine. Now, what happens with some of these vaccines, with some vaccines that have been developed over the last 50, 60 years? There are some vaccines that have been developed using cell lines derived from a child who was aborted. And this might have been a child who was aborted literally decades ago. And so this isn't body parts of the baby. These are cells derived originally from that baby, which have duplicated over the course of decades. This is not, I've seen some pro-lifers characterize this as you're injecting your body with, the cells of an aborted child. And that's really kind of crude and not exactly correct. So what I want to do today is talk about, from a pro-life perspective, how should we think about these things? And how should we think about these things in the context of coronavirus and the coronavirus vaccine? So I have as my guide to talk about this. This guy, you may have heard of him, Jonathan. Name is Joseph Ratzinger. You ever heard of this guy?
Yeah,
you ever heard of this dude?
Familiar.
Okay, so Joseph Ratzinger, small town boy,
living in a lonely world,
living in a lonely Third Reich. So Joseph Ratzinger, you know him as Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, and then eventually Pope Benedict XVI. When he was working in the Vatican under John Paul II, Joseph Ratzinger was a cardinal. And he was the head of what's called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which basically it's this committee of priests and theologians.
John,
yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but his title was much cooler. He was not the head, wasn't he?
He was the prefect.
The prefect.
He was the prefect.
If I had an option, I'm a CEO. You're an executive director. If I had any job where my title could be prefect,
that would be pretty cool.
That'd be a pretty sweet gig.
Okay, so thank you for correcting me.
I'm just saying.
Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith basically helps advise the Pope and advise the Church, the Catholic Church more broadly, on various questions that have to do with theology as well as moral theology. And he was presented with some questions. Actually, we have the exact person and year that this was asked. This was from June of 2005. A woman named Deborah Vintage wrote, who's the executive director of a pro-life organization in Largo, Florida, wrote to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to ask questions about vaccines that are developed using cell lines derived from aborted human fetuses. And this woman was basically wanting some guidance from the Vatican about, well, what are we allowed to do here as Catholics? And while I recognize that not everyone listening to this is Catholic, I recognize one of the hosts is not Catholic. I do think that the principles that Joseph Ratzinger gave for thinking about these things are very reasonable, very rational, are coming from
you could say they're
consistently
universal principles.
One could say. And that they're coming from a very solidly pro-life perspective, and I would even go so far as to say this is an apt summary of our views at Right to Life of Central California. So while Right to Life is not necessarily an explicitly Catholic entity, I think the neutral moral principles that Pope Benedict is offering here, which don't necessarily require one to be Catholic or even Christian to agree with, I think they're very sound, and I think they're worth following. So let's dig into this. Here's one of the points that Cardinal Ratzinger makes in this piece from 2005, where he talks about the difference between different ways in which one can cooperate in something that's evil. Okay, he says the first fundamental distinction to be made is between formal and material cooperation in evil. Formal cooperation is carried out when the moral agent cooperates with the immoral action of another person, sharing in the latter's evil intention. On the other hand, when a moral agent cooperates with the immoral action of another person without sharing his or her evil intention, it is a case of material cooperation. Okay, so if, a classic example of this is, all right, we're a group of guys and we want to go to an immoral place. We want to go to a strip club. We hail a taxi cab and we tell the taxi cab, drive us to the strip club. Is the taxi cab driver, by driving you there, is he like, yes, I so thoroughly, and let's imagine a very pious and holy taxi cab driver. Is he committing some grievous sin by driving you?
You could call him an uber Catholic.
An uber Catholic. One could
Come on,
call him that.
You walked into that.
One could call him that. All right. So our uber Catholic Uber driver, is he cooperating in grave evil by taking you to the strip club? Well, no. If he had the flexibility within his work and he could decide, I'm not going to drive people to strip clubs or, abortion clinics or, I don't know, murder houses, whatever.
Yes.
Then he'd say, okay, well, if I had an alternative not to do those things, I wouldn't do those things. But within the context of my job, that is my job. I'm not, formally cooperating with the immoral intention here. I'm engaged in material cooperation, okay? And then there are all kinds of ways of thinking about this, and that may or may not be immoral. There are very many cases, I think, when that taxi cab driver would be considered not to be engaging in anything immoral. Okay, so material cooperation can be divided. Ratzinger goes on and on to talk about this, Mr. Brilliant theologian and moral theologian. Material cooperation can be further divided into categories of immediate, direct, and mediate, indirect cooperation, depending on whether the cooperation is in the execution of the sinful action per se, or whether the agent acts by fulfilling the conditions, either of providing instruments or products which make it possible to commit the immoral act. Furthermore, forms of proximate cooperation and remote cooperation can be distinguished, blah, blah. So he's talking about basically there are different ways in participating in the evil of taking, aborting a child and developing a vaccine from cell lines derived from an aborted child. Okay, and where you participate along that process and why you participate along that process can change the morality of an action, okay? So here are the things that Pope Benedict sort of summarizes, and he's talking about different kinds of vaccines that were in use in 2005. He mentions various kinds of vaccines that were active in 2005, which were derived from stem cell lines from aborted children, live vaccines against rubella, other vaccines, 2 against hepatitis A, 1 against chickenpox, etc. So here's his summary, which is at the end of this. And I might even put this on the Right to Life Twitter page just to kind of give a summary of this and help explain it, because I think it's an important thing. It's something that people ask me about all the time. Here's what he says. 1, there's a grave responsibility to use alternative vaccines and to make a conscientious objection with regard to those which have moral problems. Okay, so basically, if they come up with 2 coronavirus vaccines and one of them's made without cell lines derived from aborted fetuses, and if one isn't made that way and one is made that way, let's use the one that isn't made that way. If we have the option, use it. As regards the vaccines without an alternative, the need to contest so that others may be prepared must be reaffirmed, as should be the lawfulness of using the former in the meantime, in so much as it is necessary in order to avoid a serious risk, not only for one's own children, but also, and perhaps more specifically, for the health conditions of the population as a whole, especially for pregnant women. So he's saying we need to still contest, but there might not be the same obligation not to use a vaccine like that when there aren't any other alternatives. The lawfulness of the use of these vaccines should not be misinterpreted as a declaration of the lawfulness of their production, marketing, and use, but is to be understood as being a passive material cooperation, and in its mildest and remotest sense, also active, morally justified, blah, 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 okay, to provide for the good of one's children and of the people who come in contact with those children or with the population as a whole, okay? Right now he's talking chiefly about vaccines for small children, but I think it also applies in the context of a vaccine for older people. Such cooperation occurs in a context of moral coercion of the conscience of parents who are forced to choose to act against their conscience or otherwise to put the health of their children and of the population as a whole at risk. This is an unjust alternative choice which must be eliminated as soon as possible. So with these principles, I think it's sort of a calming thing for us as Catholics in a certain sense. So or for not simply for us as Catholics, I'm talking as a Catholic, but for all of us as pro-life people, okay? What do we need to think about the coronavirus and the vaccines that are being developed for it? Well, I think there are a couple of things we need to think. 1, we need to encourage the federal government not to just need to see the clock there, Raphael. We need to encourage the federal government basically not to develop a vaccine using cell lines from aborted children. Okay, that's an important advocacy point that we have. And we actually have we'll have this linked at our Twitter account, twitter.com/RTLC, Right to Life CA. That's at Right to Life CA. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has an advocacy campaign to send a message to the Secretary of the HHS, Alex Azar, to insist and encourage that whatever COVID-19 virus is developed does not use the aborted stem cells from children, does not use cell lines from aborted children. Okay. The USCCB's position on this is basically it would be unnecessary to use cell lines from aborted children. There are lots of alternatives. Don't force Catholics to have to use this vaccine. Okay. So we have an obligation, I think, to advocate for the right kinds of things. As Christians, we have the obligation to advocate for cell lines to be produced that are not produced from immoral means from a long time ago. But if it comes down to it, where our only options are, there's one vaccine. There's only one vaccine that's been approved for use worldwide. It is unfortunately developed with cell lines from a child who was aborted decades ago. It would probably be possible, while continuing to insist that alternatives be developed, etc., it would probably be possible for us as pro-life people, as believers, to utilize a vaccine of this sort. We don't need to be left out in the cold and be without the use of a vaccine. Okay? So it's a complicated question. We're going to dig into it a little bit more with an analogy to World War II, because I think it's kind of relevant. And we'll get into it after this break. This is Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400 and the iHeartRadio app. all so much for listening to Right to Life Radio. Your production is always Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. And thank you to all of you who've signed up for the 300 Club, that exclusive club of Right to Life supporters. All you got to do, $25 a month. That's all we ask. $25 a month. Hey, you're probably spending getting more than that zapped off your credit card every month for a streaming service you never use, a streaming service or two. I feel like Jonathan might be guilty of that.
You know, John, I'll tell you. Number one, not only did I joined the 300
But
Club.
you did join the 300
I did
Club,
join
so
the
I don't
300
care.
Club.
I don't care about your wasteful streaming service.
But I also, it's slightly outside the purview of this conversation, but I did cancel Netflix.
You did?
I did,
Good
yes.
for you.
Over the
cuties thing.
Oh, my goodness. Yes, indeed.
Well, you know what, Jonathan? Good for you. I'm glad you did.
Don't ask me about Disney Plus or Hulu, but still.
But
hey.
yeah. Okay, well, you got to watch something.
Look, folks, come on. If I can cancel Netflix.
See, this is one of the problems about political conservatism at any rate. I mean, we're Right to Life Radio here. We talk about abortion, but
yeah.
I guess to be a political conservative means basically if I had to boycott absolutely every liberal thing, I couldn't watch football, basketball, Disney, Hulu, Amazon.
Yes.
Basically, I'd have to read books or something, and God forbid.
Pretty much.
All right. Anyway, read books, people. It's good for you. Okay. Anyway, moving on. So we're talking about the development of a vaccine surrounding COVID-19. And I was reading for all of you some stuff written by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, who was then a cardinal working for John Paul II and would become the Pope, Benedict XVI. And he had some very interesting things to say about cooperation with evil in the context of vaccines and whether Christians and I would say pro-life people in general, people with a pro-life ethic in general, could licitly, morally make use of vaccines that may have been developed from cell lines from children who were aborted decades ago. And this is one way to think about it. He doesn't use this language, but I think this is one way to think about it. So first is this isn't there are some pro-lifers who I think very crudely, and I don't want to say crudely putting aspersions on their motives, but from a lack of understanding or sophistication, talk about these cell lines as if we're literally putting the body parts of aborted children and injecting them into our bloodstream, which is not the case. These are individual cells that were derived from a child that was aborted 40 years ago. It's not the same thing. This is something different, all right? It isn't a thing where in and of itself, all right, this isn't cannibalism, okay, which it's something that would be intrinsically evil, which under no circumstances could happen. These are cells, not body parts of humans. This is something different, okay? So that's one thing to understand. The next thing to understand, so because it's not something that's akin to cannibalism, okay, literally ingesting or putting into your body the body parts of other people, because it's not that, I think something that it's more analogous to, Jonathan, is the research that the Nazi doctors did.
You took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say.
Yeah. Well, we do radio enough together. We eventually start thinking the exact same thoughts and
That's
finishing
right.
each other's
sandwiches.
Exactly. So with the Nazi doctors, okay, the Nazi doctors, horrible human rights abuses, terrible things that they did to Jews and to other people who were in the concentration camps, horrible live experimentation on people's nervous systems and tweaking with their brains while they're still alive without anesthesia, all kinds of horrible mutilation and
grotesque evil stuff.
Grotesquely evil stuff that the Nazi doctors did. Okay. Some of the research they did, though, was good research. And
by
they
good,
learned good in the sense of it derived useful information.
Right.
Okay. Useful information that was useful for later generations.
Not morally good, but medically advantageous.
So what is the standard by which we should look at that research? Should we just say, look, it's fruit from a poisonous tree and we can never ever use it or utilize it or have anything to do with it? Well, that seems a bit excessive. I mean, because in our day and age, it's not as though, well, I guess other than embryo-destructive stem cell research, but okay, we'll put that aside. In our day and age, that kind of research isn't being incentivized to continue to happen by the use of that research from that time. So in utilizing something that came from an immoral source, a cell line from an aborted child, research from a Nazi doctor, I think the way to think about it is basically, is my action helping to perpetuate a marketplace where this kind of immoral action continues to be necessary? Okay. That's a way to do it. Okay, if my dad, who's a surgeon, if my dad were in doing some orthopedic research, whatever, if he were to make use of something that a Nazi doctor from the 40s cooked up and he was to use that in his research, my dad is not endorsing, incentivizing those kinds of immoral activities. Okay, he's just not. When we make use of a vaccine because it happens to be the only vaccine that's available and it happened to have been made using those, using cells from a child who was aborted. Some of these cells were made from one child who was aborted in the 60s. Okay. And that act was a horrible act. That was a murder. That was a death. That was something horrific and to be bewailed. And in our public policy advocacy, in our public stances, whether as Christians or as non-Christians, we need to fight against that. But are we incentivizing that going forward? For a one-off thing like coronavirus, I don't know that that's really the case. And I think that we as Christians could have legitimately take the position that as long as we are doing our absolute best to advocate for that not to happen, if it does happen against all of our objections and there's no other way of safeguarding our society, then maybe that's something that could be morally licit. Now, I might be wrong about this. I might be wrong in my analysis, but as far as I can tell, I think this is the correct analysis. And you run the risk when you're not taking the most reactionary conservative position possible that another conservative will say that you're soft and you're a weakling. But I think, based on my reading of what Joseph Ratzinger has said in the context of other vaccines, that I think this is a legitimate viewpoint for Christians to take, or for Catholics to take. We'll be on the front lines fighting so that a coronavirus vaccine is not developed with aborted stem cell lines. Much of the news is very positive that they're not going to use those aborted cell lines. But I think that's the appropriate way to look at it. All right, we'll be back with more right after this on Right to Life Radio. yelling really loudly. But that's okay, Tony. Just tone it down there, guy. This song, of course, from the opening scene of Goodfellas. Thank you so much for listening to Right to Life Radio. We want to thank everyone who's part of our 300 Club, the 300 Club. Again, your way of contributing to Right to Life, just give us $25 a month. You get some goodies, you get some thank yous, you get sign up for our newsletter, all kinds of good stuff. I want to go through, I've got my big alphabetical list of people who've signed up. Where should I start, Jonathan? Give me a letter. Give me a letter, any letter.
Q.
Q. Oh, for QAnon? Jeez, well, Jonathan.
I hate.
All right. What's their slogan thing for those weirdos? When we go one, we go. All right,
yeah, that's right.
All right. No, we're not. This is not a QAnon show.
Nope.
We do think though that maybe there are a lot of incredibly powerful pedophiles who get away with more stuff than we know about, though.
Yep.
Anyway, this is not a QAnon show. All right. Let's start with Randy and Mary Quatrin. Thank you so much. Gloria Ramirez, Laureen Rao, Gertrude Reeves, Lorelei Remlinger, or Lorelei. Life goes on. Life goes on. Mike and Michelle Reynoso, Randall and Mary Richardson, Toby and Corinne Rien, Sylvia Rivas, Frank and Patricia Robin, Cliff and Kathy Ronk. Hey, your in-laws.
Hey.
There you go. Rosa Brothers Milk Company. Thank you so much, Rosa Brothers. Got some good ice cream, too. Leonard and Mary Ruiz, Michael Ryan.
Is that the Rosa Brothers?
I mean, unless there are two Rosa Brothers Milk Companies, I would say that's probably Rosa Brothers Milk Company.
I would accept their 300 Club sponsorship in chocolate milk. I'm just saying.
Yeah, well, hey, Rosa Brothers, maybe let's work out a deal.
Yeah.
Michael Ryan III, Judith Dickinson Risk Camp, St. Agnes Medical Center, Cameron and Brittany Sanders. Way to go, Brittany. Love you, Brittany. Patricia Santee, Cheryl Sarkeesian, Jeff and Wanda Savage, Jeff and Sherilyn Schmiedier, Francis and Maria Schmidt. All right, I think that's a good list. All right,
yeah.
So thank you all so much for joining the 300 Club. Again, it's a great way of supporting Right to Life. All right. I want to read. So we've been talking about vaccines in the context of a coronavirus vaccine and whether it's being made using fetal cell lines. So there's a good article on this from the Catholic News Agency, CNA, which is actually a very good news website for any of you out there. It's whether you're Catholic or not, it's actually a very good source for information. Right to Life endorsed, CNA. All right, so here we go. This is written by...
Non-fake news.
This is written by Matt Hadrow, whose wife, Catherine Hadrow, is the host of that EWTN Pro-Life show, which is also very good. So here we go. Washington, D.C. Is the coronavirus vaccine made from fetal cell lines? As coronavirus vaccine prototypes move closer to testing and approval, some Catholics are debating the ethical sources behind a leading vaccine candidate. On Monday, President Donald Trump announced that the vaccine mRNA-1273, co-designed by the biotech company Moderna and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, had entered Phase 3 of clinical trials. The vaccine will soon be tested for safety and to confirm that it can effectively prevent COVID-19 in 2 doses. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of NIAID, Georgetown grad, and White House health advisor, said on Monday that a vaccine is urgently required to control this pandemic, but has also cautioned in recent days that despite speedy progress, a vaccine might not be widely available until several months into 2021. The Trump administration is funding vaccine candidates as part of Operation Warp Speed. By the way, I only joke about Anthony Fauci being a Georgetown grad because I'm a Notre Dame grad, and we don't like each other. Anyway, Operation Warp Speed, making investments in vaccine candidates from Novavax, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Janssen. These are all the names of pharmaceutical companies, and they all have weird names. It is also investing $1.95 billion with Pfizer to facilitate the delivery of 100 million doses of Viagra after... Okay, sorry, that was just me. 100 million doses after a vaccine is developed. Doses of the vaccine, not Viagra.
Not Viagra.
All right, sorry, guys. On Monday, Fauci said that early testing of the Moderna vaccine indicates that it is, quote, safe and immunogenic. While demand for a vaccine is urgent, questions have been raised by some pro-life advocates about the Moderna candidate and its ethical development, specifically whether it has been tested using a fetal cell line taken from an aborted baby. The Charlotte Lozier Institute, also Right to Life endorsed, research arm of the pro-life Susan B. Anthony list, has listed the Moderna vaccine among the, quote, ethically uncontroversial COVID-19 vaccine programs, along with development projects from Inovio Pharmaceuticals, Sanofi, and Translate Bio, Pfizer and BioNTech, Novavax, and Merck IAVI. Okay, these companies have weird names. According to CLI, 2 vaccine candidates are the product of unethical programs, those being developed by the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca, and by Johnson & Johnson and Janssen Res and Development Incorporated. Research and Development Incorporated. On the straightforward question of whether the Moderna vaccine is being produced from cell lines from elective abortions, Dr. John Gerardi, Director of Institutional Relations at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, said, "It appears that the answer is no." So basically, what this is doing is saying that people have asked me, is the coronavirus vaccine going to be made from cell lines from aborted children? Okay. The answer is we don't know. Okay, there are a whole bunch of different entities trying to make a coronavirus vaccine right now. And a few of them, it seems, are using cell lines from aborted children. And
because, I mean, John, let's be frank. If there is a massive, astronomical pot of money at the end of this vaccine rainbow.
Sure.
And a lot
government
of
money mostly, but that's still a ton of money.
Government money from not just the U.S., but you think of all the governments around the world that whoever can develop a vaccine first, they can be first to market with something that is actually effective. I mean,
yeah, it's bazillions and bazillions of dollars.
So. And hey, if we have to use a few aborted fetus stem lines along the way,
well, pharmaceutical companies would never do something immoral just to put profit over everything else.
Come on.
The CNA article goes, a 2005 document from the Pontifical Academy for Life considered the moral issues surrounding vaccines prepared in cell lines descended from aborted fetuses. The Vatican group concluded that it can be both morally permissible and morally responsible for Catholics to use these vaccines. In general, the document says, in general, doctors or patients who resort to the use of these vaccines for their children, in spite of knowing their origin, voluntary abortion, carry out a form of very remote, mediate material cooperation, the Pontifical Academy said. The duty to avoid passive material cooperation is not obligatory if there is grave inconvenience. Moreover, we find in such cases a proportional reason in order to accept the use of these vaccines in the presence of the danger of favoring the spread of the pathological agent due to the lack of vaccination of children, it added. So the Pontifical Academy also noted that Catholics have an obligation to use ethically sourced vaccines when available and have an obligation to speak up and request the development of new cell lines that are not derived from aborted fetuses. So this is kind of on the nose with what I was saying in the last segment, that while I think we have an obligation, and I'll sign this, we'll share this from the Right to Life Twitter page, twitter.com/RightToLifeCA. We'll also share it on the Facebook page and in other places, that while I think we have an obligation to advocate for an ethically sourced coronavirus vaccine, we have an obligation to encourage the government to develop one. If there are ever alternatives that are ethically sourced, we have an obligation to use the ethical alternative. But if that's not the case, I think Catholics, all Christians, I think pro-life people of goodwill of all stripes could still, while continuing to decry the fact that we don't have alternatives, I think we could legitimately make use of one of these vaccines. Again, it's a question of, are our actions incentivizing the use of aborted children more and more in vaccines? And I think we have such a remote connection to, some of these are developed from a child who was aborted 40 years ago. Okay,
right.
Some of these cell lines are 40, 50, 60 years old. Some of these are literally from the 1960s.
But John, I will say, to pivot, in a worst case scenario, we can make an ethical justification. Mm-hmm. But this is a great reminder that coming up in November, there's a little proposition called Prop 15.
Yes. Well, 14.
14,
yes. And that's a very good point Jonathan makes. Okay, so right here in California, we're kind of faced with this question. How are we going to fund medical research in this state? Are we going to continue to use the body parts of aborted children? And that's the main point of Proposition 14.
And not just continue to use, like you said, 40-year-old
cell lines, to create new cell lines by aborting new children.
Are we going to incentivize the wholesale commodification and objectification of little unborn human beings?
Right, and that's exactly what Proposition 14 is doing. So for those who don't know, Proposition 14 is on the ballot this November, and this is to fund with $5.5 billion. Well, by the way, it's $5.5 billion bond, meaning that we're going to have to pay something like $7 billion because it's like a loan that you have to repay with interest. But this would be $5.5 billion that would go to the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine is basically the big stem cell research hub for the state of California. It gives grants to mostly to already very wealthy universities. Okay, Stanford has basically benefited from this more than anybody. They've gotten hundreds of millions of dollars. Boo Stanford. And basically, it's to fund research on stem cells derived from embryos, which require the destruction of those embryos. So this is sort of at the heart of the coronavirus vaccine question. Okay, do we, how do we source these things? How do we derive these things? What are our ethical constraints around science? And are we going to continue to derive? Are we going to continue to have our research be based on the commodification of other people? I mean, one of the not to say everything President George W. Bush ever did was perfect, but one of the great lines that he used back in the early 2000s when President Bush sort of significantly cut off all federal funding for embryo destructive stem cell research in 2001. It was like one of the first significant acts of his presidency. His first address to the nation from the Oval Office was about a bioethics question. And he basically said that human beings should not be created for their spare parts. And that's so true. Basically, what we see with this scientific research is basically a commodification of human life. That human life is only useful human life is only valuable insofar as it is useful. And it can be instrumentalized. And this instrumentalization of persons is, it's deeply and seriously wrong. It's at the heart of why we exist as an organization, is to make sure that this kind of viewing human life as something that only has value conditionally for me, to change that so that people look at human life as something inherently good in and of itself, something that needs to be defended and protected, both in terms of our private actions, but also not just in terms of our private actions, but also as a question of law. All right, we'll be back with closing thoughts right after this. Right to Life Radio, a production of Right to Life of Central California, rtlcc.org. It's basically, usually we do an old Italian man song just for our closing song of the show, but this week it's all elderly Italian crooners for the entire show, for those of you who didn't pick up on the theme.
It's been that kind of a year.
It's been a weird year.
We need a lot of that.
This show is, we're doing this show right now as there is tons of smoke outside, and good Lord, what a cruddy year it's been. Thoughts and prayers out to my wife, Holly, who says she has dealt with 3 separate incidents of children peeing or messing up diaper situations. Jack, my son, apparently ran into the parking lot by himself while she tried to shop with them at the grocery store twice. What others? He had an egg meltdown. This is this is a morning ritual whereby Jack does not want to eat his eggs. And if he doesn't eat his eggs, he's super cranky, but he never wants to eat his eggs, even though he loves eggs, but he doesn't want to eat them because he's 2.
Yes.
So, anyway, thoughts and prayers to Holly Gerardi, and I will be helping you out quite a bit this weekend. All right. Now, to close out the show, Jonathan noted to me, hey, the debates are coming up. The presidential debates are coming up. They are.
There's 4 of them that are currently scheduled.
Now, the thing that frustrated me about the 2016 debates is I feel like a lot of people in this country, on both sides of the question, abortion is a very big reason why people vote. I think there are a lot of conservatives for whom the desire to limit and curtail abortion is a big reason why they vote.
Yep.
And what the Supreme Court does with abortion and what kind of justices the president might appoint to the Supreme Court is a big deal.
I don't know this for sure, John, but I have a hard time thinking of any other single-issue voter base that is as committed.
That's large, as consistent, as committed. And I think on the other side, there are a lot of people like that too.
Yep.
I think a lot of pro-choice people are extremely committed.
Well, I mean, the NRA gets a lot of notice.
They do.
But they don't have 500,000 people that are marching every January.
That's true.
I'm just saying.
That's true. Or like Louis Farrakhan, who had the Million Man March.
Yeah.
Remember, there were 1 million people there because they called it the Million Man March.
Right.
There were like 50,000 people. All right.
So the debates.
My frustration from the 2016 debates was this. While there was one exchange in one of the debates in which candidate Trump pointed out Secretary Clinton's support for 3rd trimester abortion, which I think was actually a very significant moment for him in the course of that, in the course of the whole campaign. There's very little focus on abortion in the debates.
Yes.
And that seems to be consistently true. It's almost like it's such a big, such an enormously divisive topic nationally that, like, it's like that really divisive topic at the family dinner table that no one wants to talk about because we just want to get through Thanksgiving without anyone yelling at anyone. Only it's like for the whole country. And it feels like there's an embarrassment about having a real presidential debate where you actually dig into the substance of, you know, what is this thing that we have legalized and what is this way in which we have allowed basically the Supreme Court to dictate to the entire rest of the country in all 50 states exactly how they're going to regulate
But
it.
John, I don't care about that. I just want to hear responses to what the other candidate said on Twitter. That's what's really important for public policy.
You know, it makes me wish I had been on Twitter in 2012 when Mitt Romney said the thing about binders full of women, because I'm sure that was actually really hilarious to follow on Twitter. And then I'd love to see all the memes about stuff like that. But yes, the debates are coming up. And
September 29th, the first presidential debate at Case Western Reserve University and Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah. So
Tuesday, the 29th of September.
Tuesday, the 29th. So maybe we'll even, you know, maybe at some point during this election season, you know, we want to put together a big political event at some point in October. Unfortunately, it'll never be in person because we're going to be locked down until 2048. But you know, if we can, we would love to do some kind of Zoom political event focusing on all of the pro-life issue, all of the sort of political issues that are centralized in this election, not just in the presidency, but also Proposition 14 here in California and a lot of other stuff, and to discuss it all in a 501c3 compliant fashion. So, you know, this election has a huge impact on the pro-life topic. We've talked about it a lot with the possibility of eliminating the filibuster in the Senate, the possibility of, you know, Supreme Court seats opening up, of the Democrats in some ways are, you know, saber rattling that they want to pack the Supreme Court. There is a lot at stake in this election between regulatory law, between judges, there's so much at stake. And, you know, I think we do a pretty good job at this show of, you know, letting you know what the issues are that are at play. So you're nobody unless somebody loves you. This is actually a terrible theme for this show because you're somebody whether or not somebody loves you. And you know what? God loves you.
That's right.
And I love you. And Jonathan Keller from California Family Council loves you. And with that, we'll see you next week right here on Right to Life Radio.